A homeless cowgirl stands in a gleaming marble courtroom, her weathered boots out of place against the polished floor, holding documents that could change the fate of an entire community. 3 days earlier, she had been sleeping under the stars on abandoned ranch land when she spotted smoke rising from a nearby property. Using skills honed through years of ranch work, she rushed to prevent a stable fire that would have destroyed prized horses worth millions. Now facing the powerful business magnate whose animal she saved, she must reveal the truth that will either give her a second chance at life or send her back to the lonely roads she's wandered for years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Megan Riley wiped dust from her sunburned face as she studied the "No Trespassing" sign that marked the boundary of what had once been the Murphy Ranch. The harsh June sun beat down on the drought-stricken grasslands surrounding the abandoned property, lands that had once supported thriving herds of cattle for over a century. At 34, the deep creases around Megan's eyes told the story of years spent outdoors, battling the elements and increasingly impossible odds in the ranching world. The 3,000 acres of once productive rangeland now stood empty and neglected, the old ranch house boarded up, a silent reminder of the changing fortunes of Elk Valley. The small corral where Megan had tended her first horse as a teenager was now collapsing, weathered boards falling victim to years of neglect after the Murphy family had been forced to sell to developers. Unlike the massive operations that now dominated the valley, the Murphy Ranch had been a family operation focused on sustainable grazing practices and careful land management. When corporate interests began buying up water rights and pressuring smaller ranchers to sell, the Murphys had held out longer than most. "Land isn't just something you own, it's something you belong to," old Tom Murphy used to say, words that had stuck with Megan through the hardest times. Those words echoed in Megan's mind as she slipped through a gap in the fence, technically trespassing but drawn by memories of better days. She had learned everything she knew about horses and cattle on this land, working summers for the Murphy family while growing up. Now, with nothing but her beaten pickup truck, a worn saddle, and a few possessions, the abandoned ranch was sometimes a place to sleep when she couldn't afford even the cheapest motel room. Megan's path to homelessness had been neither sudden nor expected. 5 years ago, she had been managing a small but successful horse training operation, specializing in problem horses that other trainers had given up on. Her gift for understanding troubled animals had earned her respect in ranching circles across 3 states. Then came the accident, a young stallion spooked by a sudden thunderstorm, a bad fall, and months of recovery from a shattered leg. The medical bills had devoured her savings. Without insurance, each surgery and physical therapy session had pushed her deeper into debt. By the time she could walk without assistance, the bank had repossessed her modest property, her truck was nearly repossessed, and her clients had found other trainers. Pride had kept her from asking for help, and gradual desperation had led her to a nomadic existence, picking up temporary ranch work where she could find it, sleeping in her truck or under the stars when necessary. Megan made her way toward the creek that ran through the property, one of the few reliable water sources left in the drought-stricken valley. She had stashed a few supplies, a tarp, some canned food, basic toiletries, in a hollow tree nearby, her emergency cash for the hardest times. As she approached the creek, movement on the neighboring property caught her attention. The land bordering the old Murphy place had been purchased 2 years ago by Westridge Enterprises, a development company owned by billionaire Jackson Westridge. Rumors had swirled through the valley about Westridge's plans: a luxury resort, a private hunting reserve, or simply land speculation. Whatever the purpose, massive fences had been erected, security cameras installed, and local ranch hands hired to patrol the boundaries. What caught Megan's attention now was smoke, not the controlled burn of land management, but the thick, black smoke of something artificial burning. Following the creek that crossed both properties, she moved cautiously toward the source, staying low in the dry brush. As she crested a small rise, she saw it, flames licking at the wooden walls of an expensive-looking stable complex. 2 men were visible, frantically pulling hoses that seemed to have inadequate water pressure, while the sounds of panicked horses came from inside the burning structure. Without hesitation, Megan abandoned caution and ran toward the fire. "Hey!" she shouted to the men. "Are there horses still inside?" The older of the 2 men turned, his face streaked with soot. "4 in the back stalls, we can't reach them." "Water pressure's too low," the younger man added, his voice strained. "We called for help, but the fire trucks are at least 30 minutes out." Megan quickly assessed the situation. The fire appeared to have started near the front of the stable, but was spreading rapidly toward the back where the horses were trapped. Smoke billowed from the entrance, making a direct approach impossible. "Is there a back entrance?" she asked, already moving around the building. "Service door on the north side," the older man called after her. "But it might be locked." Megan raced around the burning structure, the heat intense even from a distance. She found the service door, secured with a padlock. Without hesitation, she grabbed a shovel leaning against the wall and smashed at the lock, the metal giving way after several powerful strikes. Inside, the smoke was thick but not yet impenetrable. 4 beautiful thoroughbreds were in the back stalls, eyes white with terror, pulling desperately at their leads. Megan moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had handled frightened horses all her life. She spoke in low, soothing tones as she approached the first animal, a magnificent bay stallion worth more than anything she had ever owned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Easy, boy. We're getting out of here." Her hands worked quickly, releasing the panic snap-on, the lead rope. Rather than trying to lead the terrified animal, she removed his halter entirely, knowing that horses would naturally flee from danger if given the chance. She repeated the process with each horse, removing halters and leads, then using the flat of her hand against their hindquarters to urge them toward the open door. The final horse, a gray mare, seemed paralyzed with fear, refusing to move despite the approaching flames. Megan found a horse blanket hanging nearby and draped it over the mare's head, creating a makeshift blindfold. With the visual stimuli reduced, the mare became more manageable. Megan led her firmly toward the exit, emerging from the smoke just as portions of the roof began to collapse behind them. Outside, the 2 ranch hands had managed to round up the other horses in a nearby paddock. They stared at Megan in amazement as she emerged with the gray mare, soot-covered but composed. The mare, once clear of the burning building, calmed enough for Megan to remove the improvised blindfold. "That's Eclipse," the older ranch hand said in disbelief. "Mr. Westridge's prize broodmare, worth over $1 million. Megan handed the lead rope to him, suddenly aware of her appearance: dirty jeans, worn boots, her second-hand jacket now smudged with soot. She didn't look like someone who should be handling $1-million horses. "I should go," she said, already backing away. Getting involved with a billionaire's property, even to help, seemed risky for someone in her precarious position. "Wait," the younger man stepped forward. "Who are you? How did you know what to do with the horses?" "Just someone who knows horses," Megan replied vaguely. "The fire department should be here soon. They'll need to know if anyone was injured." Before either man could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. Not fire trucks, but 3 black SUVs moving rapidly up the private road. Megan tensed, her instinct to avoid attention from people with money and power kicking in strongly. The vehicles pulled to a stop, and several men in suits emerged from the first 2. From the third stepped a tall man in his 50s, his bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to authority. Even dressed casually in what appeared to be custom-made ranch clothes, everything about him spoke of wealth and influence. "Mr. Westridge," the older ranch hand called out. "We got all the horses out. The fire started in the feed room, electrical we think." Jackson Westridge surveyed the scene, his expression grim as he watched his expensive stable burn. Then, his attention turned to the horses, his eyes quickly counting and assessing. "Eclipse?" he asked sharply. "Safe, sir," the ranch hand assured him, gesturing to where the gray mare stood. "This woman got her out. Got all 4 of the thoroughbreds out through the back when we couldn't reach them." Westridge's piercing gaze fell on Megan, taking in her weathered appearance with a single sweeping glance. She fought the urge to shrink back, standing her ground even as she recognized the calculation in his eyes, the automatic assessment of someone's worth and utility that came naturally. "To the very wealthy, you got my horses out." His voice was deep, with the polished edge of someone educated at expensive schools. "Yes." Megan kept her answer simple, meeting his gaze directly. "Are you with the fire department?" "No. I was nearby and saw the smoke." One of the suited men leaned toward Westridge, whispering something in his ear. The billionaire frowned slightly, his expression hardening as he looked back at Megan with new suspicion. "You were nearby?" "This is private property, surrounded by 8-foot security fencing with posted warnings every 100 yards. Megan hesitated, caught between truth and self-preservation. Before she could formulate a response, the wail of approaching sirens announced the fire department's arrival. Westridge held her gaze for a moment longer. "We'll continue this conversation after the fire is dealt with," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "Martin, make sure our guest doesn't wander off." One of the suited men nodded, taking up a position where he could clearly watch Megan. She considered making a run for it, but discarded the idea. The last thing she needed was to be charged with trespassing after being identified. Better to face Westridge's questions and hope that saving his valuable horses would outweigh any concerns about how she happened to be on his property. The next hour passed in controlled chaos as firefighters battled the blaze, eventually containing it to the stable building alone. The horses were moved to a secondary facility further from the fire, with Megan quietly offering assistance that was accepted without question by the ranch hands who had seen her skill with the frightened animals. As the situation stabilized, she found herself seated at a rough wooden table outside the ranch's main house, a sprawling log mansion that somehow managed to look both authentically Western and obscenely luxurious. Jackson Westridge sat across from her, his initial suspicion now tempered with something that might have been curiosity. "So," he began, "Martin tells me you're Megan Riley, used to train problem horses throughout the region until about 5 years ago. Since then, you've been off the grid, taking odd jobs at ranches across 3 states. He paused, studying her face, currently without fixed address. Megan maintained her composure, though inwardly she was surprised at how quickly they had compiled information about her. "That's correct. May I ask what you were doing on my property today, Ms. Riley?" Megan considered lying, then decided against it. "I was actually on the Murphy property next door. I used to work there years ago. The creek crosses both properties. I followed the smoke when I saw it." "The Murphy property," Westridge repeated thoughtfully. "Technically owned by Valley Development Corporation now, a subsidiary of my company. We acquired it last year." This was news to Megan, though it made sense. Valley Development had been buying distressed properties throughout the region. "So you were trespassing on my land either way," Westridge continued, though his tone lacked the edge of accusation she had expected. "Yes," Megan admitted. "I sometimes sleep there when I'm passing through. It's familiar territory." Brief silence fell as Westridge seemed to consider this information. "The horses you saved today are worth approximately $4 million collectively. Eclipse alone is worth $1.5 million and is irreplaceable for my breeding program. Megan said nothing, unsure where this was leading. My security chief thinks you started the fire yourself to play hero, Westridge continued, his eyes never leaving her face. A clever way to ingratiate yourself with someone wealthy, perhaps angle for a reward or a job. Megan felt a flash of anger but controlled it. If I were looking for work, Mr. Westridge, there are easier ways to apply than arson. To her surprise, a slight smile touched the billionaire's face. That was my assessment as well. The preliminary report suggests an electrical fault in the old wiring, which matches what my ranch manager has been warning me about for months. He leaned forward slightly, so the question becomes, what do I do with you now, Ms. Riley? Megan tensed, ready for accusations or threats. What came instead caught her completely off guard. I need someone who understands horses at a fundamental level, Westridge said. Most of the local ranch hands are adequate for basic care, but I've acquired several valuable animals with significant behavioral issues, animals that previous trainers have given up on. Megan's interest was piqued despite her wariness. Problem. Horses had been her specialty, her passion before everything fell apart. I've actually been looking for someone with your particular expertise, Westridge continued. Your name came up in conversation with several breeders, though no one seemed to know where you had gone. I've been around, Megan said carefully, taking work where I can find it. I'm prepared to offer you a position, Westridge said abruptly. 6 months, to start. Room and board on the property, plus salary. I have 3 horses specifically that need rehabilitation before they can be useful for breeding or competition. Megan blinked, caught off guard by the sudden offer. A stable job, housing, regular income, things she had almost stopped believing were possible. Why would you hire someone you just met? Someone who is trespassing on your property? Her natural suspicion surfaced. People like Westridge didn't make spontaneous job offers to homeless drifters without an agenda. I make decisions based on results, Ms. Riley. You saved 4 valuable horses today when my paid staff couldn't. You did it with skill and without hesitation. He gestured toward the paddock where Eclipse and the other thoroughbreds had been temporarily housed. More importantly, you handled those animals correctly even in a crisis. That indicates both knowledge and instinct. He stood, signaling the conversation was nearing its end. Of course, if you're not interested, you're free to leave. No charges for trespassing, and my thanks for your assistance today. Megan hesitated, weighing her options. 6 months of stability would allow her to save money, perhaps begin rebuilding her life. But working for someone like Westridge came with its own risks. The wealthy played by different rules, and she had learned the hard way how quickly fortunes could change. I'd want to see the horses first, she said finally. Understand what I'd be working with. Westridge nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. Tomorrow morning. For tonight, my housekeeper will show you to a guest room. Unless you'd prefer to return to your accommodations on the Murphy property. There was no mockery in his tone, which somehow made the question more pointed. Megan thought of her pickup truck with its worn seats, the tarp stretched between trees that had been her shelter for the past week. A guest room would be fine, she said, maintaining her dignity. Thank you. As a ranch hand was summoned to escort her to the main house, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into something far more complicated than a simple job offer. Jackson Westridge had the calculating gaze of someone who saw people as assets or obstacles, not unlike the corporate entities that had been systematically destroying the traditional ranching way of life throughout the valley. Yet the prospect of working with horses again, real work, not just the menial labor she had been subsisting on, stirred something in her that had been dormant for too long. Tomorrow she would see these problem horses, assess whether she could actually help them, and then decide whether to accept Westridge's unexpected offer. What Megan couldn't possibly know was that the fire and her response to it had set in motion events that would not only change her own life, but potentially the future of the entire valley. Jackson Westridge's interest in her skills was difficult. Horses was genuine, but it was only one small part of a much larger plan, a plan that had been years in the making and would soon draw Megan into a conflict far beyond anything she could imagine. The guest room Megan was shown to was larger than any apartment she had ever rented, decorated in what interior designers probably called rustic luxury, handcrafted furniture that managed to look both authentic and ridiculously expensive. With subtle technological touches like automated lighting and climate control discreetly integrated into the log cabin aesthetic. She showered in a bathroom bigger than her old trailer, washing away years of dust and weariness, if only temporarily. The hot water seemed endless, a luxury she had almost forgotten. Clean clothes had been provided, simple jeans and shirts. In approximately her size, tags still attached, suggesting someone had been dispatched to purchase them specifically. The casual display of wealth, buying new clothes for an unexpected guest without a second thought, reminded her sharply of the world she had entered. As she toweled her hair dry, Megan caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman reflected there. 5 years of hardship had stripped away any softness, leaving her lean and weathered. Her once shoulder-length blonde hair was now sun-bleached and roughly cut short for practicality. The eyes that stared back at her were still the same clear blue, but they held a wariness that hadn't been there before. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. The housekeeper, Mrs. Thornton, informed her that dinner would be served in 30 minutes if she cared to join Mr. Westridge. The invitation was presented as optional, but Megan suspected that declining might be interpreted as rudeness. Besides, she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Jackson Westridge's interest in her skills with horses was genuine, but it was merely one small component of a much larger plan, a plan that would soon draw her into a conflict that would determine the future of the entire valley and everyone who called it home. The fire that had brought her to Westridge Ranch had been no accident. And while saving the valuable horses had indeed impressed the billionaire, it was not the only reason he had offered her a position. There were secrets buried in Elk Valley, secrets that connected Megan's past to Westridge's future in ways neither of them yet fully understood. As dawn broke over the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Megan Riley stood at a pivotal crossroads, though she didn't yet realize it. The decision she would make in the coming day would set her on a path that would either restore everything she had lost or cost her what little she had left. Megan woke before dawn, a lifetime habit from her ranching days. For a moment, she was disoriented by the comfortable bed and elegant room, so different from the truck seats and makeshift shelters she had grown accustomed to. The events of the previous day came flooding back. The stable fire, the rescued horses, Westridge's unexpected job offer. She dressed in the new clothes provided, appreciating their quality while feeling slightly uncomfortable at the charity. After braiding her short hair back from her face, she slipped out of the guest wing, following the scent of coffee to the kitchen. The house staff seemed surprised to see her up so early, but provided her with coffee and directions to the stables. The morning air was crisp and clean as Megan walked the path toward the horse facilities. The main stable complex, untouched by yesterday's fire, was unlike any she had ever seen, more like an equine resort than a working ranch building. 30 stalls lined a center aisle with perfect footing, each equipped with automatic waterers and monitoring systems. The tack room gleamed with well-maintained saddles and bridles, many bearing the marks of prestigious European makers. "Impressive, isn't it?" The voice came from behind her. Megan turned to find a woman in her early 60s, dressed in practical riding clothes, but with an air of authority that marked her as more than a stable hand. "I'm Eleanor Westridge," the woman said, extending her hand. "Jackson's sister and the actual horse person in the family." Megan shook her hand, noting the firm grip and calluses that spoke of years of hands-on horsework. "Megan Riley." I know who you are, Eleanor replied with a directness Megan appreciated. I advised my brother to look for you 2 years ago when we acquired the jumper with fence issues. Your reputation with problem horses was legendary in certain circles. This was surprising information. You knew about me? Of course. I've followed your career since you turned around that Satan's pride mare that everyone else had given up on. Brilliant work, patience over force, understanding instead of dominance. Eleanor gestured for Megan to follow her. Jackson may have made the offer, but I'm the one who'll be evaluating your work with our problem cases. As they walked, Eleanor explained her role at Westridge Ranch. While Jackson managed the business empire, Eleanor oversaw the equestrian program, a growing collection of valuable sport horses and breeding stock that represented both a passion and a significant investment. My brother understands the financial potential of exceptional bloodlines, she explained, but he doesn't truly understand horses. That's my department. They approached a series of paddocks set apart from the main stable area. In the first, a magnificent bay thoroughbred moved with the fluid grace of an elite athlete, his conformation nearly perfect, except for a slight tension visible in his shoulders. Prometheus, Eleanor said. Purchased for $1.8 million as our foundation jumper. Impeccable bloodlines, multiple Grand Prix wins. 8 months ago, he had a bad fall at a competition. Rider error, not his fault. Since then, he refuses to approach jumps. Perfectly sound physically, the issue is entirely psychological. Megan studied the horse's movement, noting how he carried himself, the alertness in his eyes, the subtle signs of his personality evident even from a distance. The second paddock held a powerful black stallion who paced the fence line with an intensity that bordered on aggression. Midnight Emperor, Eleanor continued. Exceptional dressage prospect, but he's developed dangerous handling issues. Attacked. His last 2 trainers put one in the hospital. We've had 3 different experts work with him, each more forceful than the last. The result is a horse that now views all humans as enemies. The third paddock contained a chestnut mare with a refined head and intelligent eyes. She grazed peacefully, looking deceptively calm. Duchess, Eleanor said. Perfect in every way. Until you try to mount her. Then she rears, violently and without warning. One rider has already been seriously injured. The current theory is that she has back pain, but extensive veterinary examinations have found nothing physical. Megan absorbed the information, already forming impressions and potential approaches for each case. These were not simple behavioral issues, but complex psychological challenges, exactly the kind of work she had once specialized in. May I see them closer? She asked. Not to handle them yet, just to observe. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Exactly the right approach. Observation first, action later. Most trainers want to immediately assert dominance, show the horse who's boss. That's exactly what's failed with these 3. They spent the next 2 hours quietly observing each horse. Megan asked occasional questions about their histories, previous training approaches, daily routines, and diet. She paid particular attention to how each animal responded to various stimuli, distant sounds, movements, the presence of humans at different distances. By mid-morning, Jackson Westridge joined them, dressed in business casual attire that suggested he had already been working for hours. What's your assessment? He asked Megan directly, bypassing pleasantries. They're all salvageable, Megan replied with quiet confidence. None of them are inherently dangerous or damaged beyond rehabilitation. They're responding logically to what they've experienced. Explain, Westridge prompted, his tone suggesting he was genuinely interested rather than challenging her. Prometheus isn't afraid of jumping itself. He's afraid of what happened when he jumped. The fall created a negative association that's been reinforced by anxious handlers and trainers focused on the problem rather than rebuilding his confidence. She gestured toward the stallion's paddock. Midnight Emperor has learned that humans bring pain and confusion. His aggression is defensive, not malicious. He's protecting himself from what he perceives as threats based on his experiences. Finally, she turned toward the mare. Duchess is the most complex. Her rearing isn't about pain, it's communication. Something about being mounted triggers. A panic response. Could be a past trauma, could be something as simple as a rider who was once unbalanced and hurt her unintentionally. Either way, she's trying to prevent what she perceives as inevitable pain or fear. Eleanor was nodding, clearly impressed with the assessment. Westridge's expression remained neutral, though Megan thought she detected a flicker of satisfaction. "How would you approach their rehabilitation?" he asked. Megan outlined her approach for each horse. Gradual desensitization for Prometheus, starting with groundwork nowhere near jumps and slowly rebuilding positive associations. For Midnight Emperor, a complete reset in human interactions, beginning with passive presence and absolutely no pressure or force. For Duchess, a careful process of isolating exactly what triggered her fear response and systematically addressing it. The common element is time, she concluded. None of these issues will be resolved quickly. Rushing the process will only reinforce their negative associations. How long? Westridge asked directly. 3 to 6 months for meaningful progress. Perhaps longer for complete rehabilitation, depending on how deeply ingrained these behaviors are. He seemed to consider this. The industry standard approach would be sedatives, stronger equipment, and forceful retraining. Or simply cutting our losses and selling them for whatever we can get. It wasn't a question, but Megan answered anyway. Those approaches might create temporary compliance through fear or chemical suppression, but they wouldn't address the underlying issues. The behaviors would eventually return, likely worse than before. "My brother is asking if you can guarantee results," Eleanor interjected, her tone suggesting she disapproved of the question. Megan met Westridge's gaze directly. "I can't guarantee specific outcomes or timelines. Anyone who does is either lying or doesn't understand horses. What I can guarantee is that my approach won't cause additional damage and has the best chance of successful rehabilitation based on my experience." A long moment of silence followed as Westridge seemed to evaluate not just her words, but her character. Finally, he nodded. "The position is yours if you want it. Standard employment contract, confidentiality agreements, the usual legalities. 6 months initial term, housing provided in the staff quarters, salary commensurate with top-tier specialist rates." He named a figure that was more than Megan had earned in her best years as an independent trainer. Why? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Why this investment in these particular horses? "You could buy new ones for what you're offering to pay me." A slight smile touched Westridge's face. A reasonable question. "Partly it's principle. I dislike writing off valuable assets. Partly it's reputation. Westridge Enterprises doesn't admit failure in any venture." He paused, and something more genuine entered his expression. "And partly it's my sister's conviction that these animals deserve better than being discarded because humans have failed them." Eleanor looked surprised at this acknowledgement, suggesting such sentimentality wasn't common from her brother. "I'll need complete authority over their care and training," Megan said. "No interference from other trainers or handlers, even well-intentioned." "Agreed," Westridge replied without hesitation. "Eleanor will be your liaison, but the rehabilitation program will be entirely your responsibility. Results, whether success or failure, will be yours as well." The terms were more than fair, generous even. Yet Megan still felt a nagging suspicion that there was more to this situation than a billionaire's concern for 3 troubled horses. "I accept," she said finally. "When do I start?" "You already have," Eleanor said with approval. "The observation you've done this morning is the first step in any proper rehabilitation program." As they walked back toward the main complex to handle the paperwork, Megan noticed activity around the burned stable, workers already clearing debris, architects and contractors consulting with ranch staff. The efficiency of wealth. No waiting for insurance adjusters or saving for repairs. Just immediate action to restore what had been damaged. In the ranch office, Megan reviewed and signed the employment contract, trying not to show her amazement at the salary and benefits package. 6 months at this rate would give her enough savings to potentially restart her own training business, assuming she could rebuild her reputation. The staff quarters proved to be a comfortable 2-bedroom cabin. Not far from the main stable complex, modest compared to the main house but luxurious by Megan's recent standards. A ranch hand delivered her few possessions from her truck, which had been located and brought to the property. By mid-afternoon, Megan was officially installed as Westridge Ranch's specialist equine rehabilitation trainer. She spent the remainder of the day establishing a workspace in an empty office near the stables, reviewing the detailed medical and training records for her 3 charges, and developing initial rehabilitation plans. As evening approached, she walked the property, familiarizing herself with the layout and facilities. The scale of Westridge's operation became increasingly apparent. Beyond the main stable complex and pastures were extensive cattle operations, equipment barns, staff housing, and what appeared to be newly constructed research facilities of some kind. Near the eastern boundary, she encountered a fence line separating Westridge property from neighboring land. A weathered sign identified it as the Davidson Ranch, one of the few remaining family operations in the valley, according to what she had overheard from the stable staff. As she stood at the fence, a pickup truck approached from the Davidson side, dust billowing behind it. The vehicle stopped, and a man approximately her age stepped out. His weathered face and practical clothing marked him as a working rancher, not unlike herself before her accident. "You must be the new horse trainer," he said without preamble. "Word travels fast around here." "Megan Riley," she introduced herself, extending a hand across the fence. "Matt Davidson," he replied, his handshake firm but not challenging. "My family's been ranching this land for 4 generations. There was something in his tone, not quite hostility, but a certain wariness that suggested complicated feelings about his wealthy neighbor. "Heard you saved some fancy horses from a fire," he continued. "Impressive work." "Right place, right time," Megan replied modestly. "I used to work at the Murphy place years ago. Just happened to be passing through." Davidson's expression shifted at the mention of the Murphy ranch. Tom Murphy was a good man. His place shouldn't have ended up in corporate hands. "I heard Westridge's company acquired it recently," Megan said, probing gently for information. "Acquired is a polite way of putting it," Davidson replied, his voice hardening slightly. "Valley Development, Westridge's shell company, has been buying up water rights throughout the region. Then mysteriously, neighboring ranches start having water problems. When they can't sustain their operations, Valley Development offers to buy them out for cents on the dollar." Megan frowned. "That sounds like more than coincidence." "It's a pattern," Davidson confirmed. "Started about 3 years ago. Half the family ranches in this valley have been acquired since then. The Murphys held out longer than most, but when their well went dry 2 seasons in a row, they didn't have much choice." The conversation was taking an uncomfortable turn, but Megan's curiosity was piqued. Why would Westridge want all this land? "From what I've seen, he's more interested in his thoroughbreds than cattle ranching." Davidson's laugh held no humor. "That's the million-dollar question. Whatever he's planning, it's not traditional ranching. There are surveyors all over the valley, soil samples being taken, new buildings going up with no clear agricultural purpose." He gestured toward the research facilities she had noticed earlier. Lots of activity, lots of security, and absolutely no information shared with the local community. Before Megan could respond, the sound of an approaching TV drew their attention. David Lawrence, the coup she had met briefly the previous evening, was heading in their direction. Looks like the corporate watchdog is coming to make sure you're not getting unauthorized information, Davidson said quietly. Be careful, Megan Riley. Westridge didn't hire you just for your horse skills, no matter what he claims. With that cryptic warning, he returned to his truck and drove away, leaving Megan with more questions than answers as Lawrence approached. Making friends with the neighbors? Lawrence asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Just introducing myself, Megan replied neutrally. I like to know the surrounding community when I'm working somewhere new. Lawrence studied her for a moment. Matt Davidson is passionate about his family's heritage, not always objective about the economic realities of modern agriculture. Most ranchers feel strongly about land that's been in their families for generations, Megan observed. It's more than just a business to them. A perspective that's becoming increasingly unsustainable in today's market, Lawrence replied. Smoothly, sentimentality doesn't pay the bills or compete with economies of scale. The conversation was revealing more about Westridge Enterprises' philosophy than perhaps Lawrence intended. Megan kept her expression neutral, neither agreeing nor challenging his statement. Eleanor asked me to let you know that dinner will be served at the main house at 7, Lawrence continued, changing the subject. Jack wants to introduce you to some of the senior staff. Megan thanked him for the message, and Lawrence departed. On his TV, casting one last evaluating glance at her before heading back toward the main complex. Left alone at the fence line, Megan considered what she had learned. Davidson's accusations about water rights manipulation and strategic acquisition of family ranches suggested a systematic approach to land consolidation, far beyond what would be needed for an expanded equestrian operation. Lawrence's dismissive attitude toward traditional ranching values aligned with this picture, suggesting a corporate strategy that viewed the valley's agricultural heritage as an outdated obstacle to progress. What didn't make sense was Westridge's investment in the problem horses. If his true interest was land acquisition for some larger purpose, why divert resources to rehabilitating 3 animals that most businesses would simply replace? Megan returned to her cabin to prepare for dinner, her mind working through the puzzle. The job offer remained attractive. The salary alone would transform her circumstances, but she was increasingly certain that there were layers to this situation she didn't yet understand. The dinner that evening was a relatively small affair by Westridge standards, just 8 people around a table that could have seated 30. Besides Jackson and Eleanor Westridge and David Lawrence, there were several department heads Megan was introduced to: the chief of security, the ranch operations manager, the head of research and development, and a woman introduced simply as our sustainability consultant. The conversation flowed easily between topics: recent thoroughbred auction results, cattle market projections, water management strategies for the upcoming season. Megan mostly listened, contributing only when directly addressed, gathering impressions of the operation and its leadership. What struck her most was the contrast between discussions of the equestrian program, which were detailed and passionate, primarily driven by Eleanor, and references to the traditional ranching operations, which were clinically economic in nature. The thoroughbreds were discussed as individuals with personalities and potential. The cattle were inventory units with profit margins. After dinner, Westridge invited Megan to join him in his study, a wood-paneled room lined with books on business, technology, and somewhat surprisingly, environmental science. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered another spectacular view of the valley, now lit by moonlight. What do you think of our operation so far? He asked, pouring himself a small measure of whiskey. He offered her one, which she declined. Impressive in scale and quality, Megan replied honestly. Though it seems to have multiple directions: sport horses, cattle, research, land acquisition. Not the focused business model I would expect from someone with your reputation. Westridge smiled slightly, seeming to appreciate her directness. Diversification is a fundamental business strategy, Ms. Riley. But you're right. There's a larger vision connecting these apparently disparate elements. He moved to a large topographical map of the valley mounted on one wall. Elk Valley represents something unique, a relatively contained ecosystem with diverse agricultural potential, significant water resources, and limited development. A perfect test case, you might say. Test case for what? Megan asked, her curiosity overriding her caution. Westridge considered her for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. The future of American agriculture, he said finally. A complete reimagining of how we produce food, manage natural resources, and sustain rural communities. The grandiosity of this statement might have seemed absurd coming from anyone else, but Westridge's matter-of-fact delivery made it clear he was entirely serious. And this requires buying out all the family ranches in the valley? Megan asked, thinking of Davidson's accusations. Something flickered in Westridge's eyes, surprise, perhaps, that she had already heard these concerns. Change always faces resistance, particularly from those most invested in the status quo. The Davidson family, for instance, represents 7 generations of traditional cattle ranching, admirable in its way, but increasingly untenable economically and environmentally. So you're doing them a favor by forcing them out? The words came out more confrontational than Megan had intended, but Westridge didn't seem offended. I'm offering fair market value for land that will become increasingly unsustainable under current management practices, he replied evenly. The water rights acquisitions you've likely heard about are part of a comprehensive watershed management strategy, not some villainous plot to drive out family farms. He returned to his desk, studying her with that calculating gaze. You have first-hand experience with how quickly agricultural fortunes can change, Ms. Riley. One bad season, one accident, one bank decision, and generations of work can disappear. The system is fundamentally unstable for individual operators. The reference to her own past stung, but Megan maintained her composure. And your system would be more stable? Objectively, yes. Integrated resource management, diverse revenue streams, technology-enabled efficiency, and scale that can weather individual setbacks. He leaned forward slightly. But that's not why I hired you. Your job is the horses, 3 valuable animals that deserve better than being discarded because of fixable problems. Focus on that task, and let me worry about the larger vision for the valley. The dismissal was polite but clear. Megan thanked him for the evening and left the study, more unsettled than when she had entered. Westridge's explanation of his valley-wide ambitions seemed reasonable on the surface, even visionary in some respects, yet it didn't fully explain the methods Davidson had described. As she walked back to her cabin under the vast starlit sky, Megan felt caught between worlds. The job offered her a chance at financial recovery and professional redemption, working with horses in exactly the way she had once loved, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that in accepting Westridge's offer, she had stepped into a much larger conflict, one where the future of an entire community hung in the balance. What she couldn't know was that Jackson Westridge had not revealed his true motivations, either for the valley or for hiring her specifically. Behind his talk of agricultural innovation and economic reality lay secrets that connected directly to Megan's own past, connections that would soon force her to choose between her personal recovery and the survival of the valley's traditional way of life. The rehabilitation work with the 3 troubled horses would indeed test her skills to their limits, but it was another test altogether that would ultimately determine her future and the fate of Elk Valley. As she reached her cabin, Megan resolved to proceed carefully, to do the job she had been hired for while keeping her eyes and ears open to the larger game being played around her. Tomorrow she would begin the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust with animals that had learned to fear humans. What she didn't realize was that her own trust would soon be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. 3 weeks into her position at Westridge Ranch, Megan found herself settled into a rhythm that both challenged and fulfilled her. Each morning began before dawn with quiet observation of her 3 equine patients, studying their behavior when they believed themselves unwatched. These silent sessions often revealed more about their psychological states than any active training could. Today, she sat cross-legged on a mounting block outside Midnight Emperor's paddock, motionless except for the occasional note she jotted in her journal. The powerful black stallion had initially responded to her presence with aggressive displays, charging the fence, snorting threats, pawing the ground. Now, on the 22nd day of her simply being present without making demands, he occasionally grazed within 20 feet of where she sat, still watchful but no longer perceiving her as an immediate threat. Progress is measured in inches, not miles, she murmured to herself, a mantra from her earlier days as a trainer. The stallion's ears flicked toward her voice, but he didn't raise his head from grazing, another small victory. A soft footfall behind her announced Eleanor Westridge's arrival. The older woman had become a daily visitor to Megan's sessions, observing not just the horses, but Megan's methods with keen interest. 3 weeks of sitting, Eleanor commented, though her tone held admiration rather than criticism. Most trainers would have been in that paddock with a whip on day 1, showing him who's boss, and reinforcing everything he already believes about humans, Megan replied, not taking her eyes off the stallion. He needs to unlearn fear before he can learn trust. Eleanor settled beside her on the mounting block, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Jackson's getting inquiries about your progress. The board is questioning the expense of your position for what they see as lack of measurable results. Megan had expected this. Corporate mindsets demanded metrics, timelines, deliverables, concepts that often clashed with the organic process of rehabilitating traumatized animals. I'm documenting everything, she said, tapping her journal. Heart rates, distance thresholds, stress behaviors, recovery times. There's measurable progress with all 3, just not the kind that shows up neatly on a spreadsheet. Eleanor smiled slightly. I understand that. My brother even understands it, to a degree. But David Lawrence and the board see only expensive horses not performing their intended functions, and a specialist being paid a premium wage to sit and watch them. If they want quick results, I can create the appearance of progress, Megan said evenly. Sedatives, restraints, and force would have these horses appearing compliant within days. Of course, they'd be ticking time bombs of suppressed trauma, but the spreadsheets would look better temporarily. That won't be necessary, came a male voice. Both women turned to find Jackson Westridge approaching, dressed more casually than Megan had yet seen him in jeans and a button-down shirt. The board will accept my assessment of the situation. Eleanor looked surprised by her brother's appearance at the stable so early in the morning. You're usually in meetings at this hour. I rescheduled, he replied, his attention on the black stallion who had retreated to the far end of the paddock at his approach. I wanted to see Ms. Riley's methods firsthand. Megan stood, brushing off her jeans. With respect, Mr. Westridge, your presence is disrupting today's session. The stallion associates men with pain and dominance. Your arrival has just erased about 30 minutes of gradual relaxation. Rather than taking offense, Westridge seemed intrigued. How can you tell? His posture, ear position, muscle tension. Along the neck and shoulders, Megan explained. He's gone from cautious grazing to high alert. His breathing rate has increased, and he's positioned himself for both clear sight lines and quick escape routes. Westridge studied the horse with new attention. And how do you interpret those signals? He's terrified, but preparing to fight if necessary, Megan said simply. Previous handlers taught him that submission leads to more abuse, so he's learned that aggression is his only defense. A moment of silence followed as Westridge appeared to process this information. Show me your documentation, he said finally. Megan handed over her journal, which contained detailed notes on each horse's progress, behavioral patterns, and response metrics. Westridge flipped through it with the focus of someone accustomed to quickly extracting relevant information from complex data. "You've developed quantitative measures for subjective states," he observed, sounding genuinely impressed. "Stress indicators, thrust thresholds, approach tolerances, all tracked daily and graphed for pattern recognition. Horses communicate clearly if you know how to read the signals," Megan replied. "The challenge is translating those communications into data that makes sense to people who don't speak their language." Westridge handed back the journal. "The board will require a formal presentation at the 6-week mark. Prepare your data and visual evidence of progress, however incremental. I'll handle the financial justifications." With that, he departed, as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving Megan and Eleanor exchanging surprised glances. "That was unexpected," Eleanor commented once her brother was out of earshot. "Jack rarely intervenes personally in operational matters, especially when Lawrence has raised concerns." Megan turned her attention back to the stallion, who was gradually returning to a less defensive posture now that the male presence had departed. "Does your brother have a particular interest in these horses beyond their monetary value?" Eleanor considered the question. "Not in the horses specifically, but he's always been drawn to methodical approaches to complex problems. Your rehabilitation process seems to have caught his attention on those grounds." The rest of the morning unfolded according to Megan's carefully structured schedule. After observing Midnight Emperor, she moved to Prometheus, the jumper with fence anxiety, where she continued a desensitization program that never directly approached a jump, but instead created positive experiences in the general vicinity of jumping equipment. By afternoon, she was working with Duchess, the mare with the rearing problem. This case had proven the most complex, as the mare showed no anxiety during groundwork or saddling. The problem manifested only at the precise moment of mounting, suggesting a very specific trigger rather than general fear or pain. Today marked a significant step in Duchess's program. After 3 weeks of modified groundwork designed to build the mare's confidence and establish clear communication, Megan planned to simulate mounting pressure for the first time. Eleanor remained to observe, along with the head groom who had been assisting with the daily care of all 3 horses. Megan had brought Duchess to the round pen, where the mare moved calmly on a long lead line, showing no signs of anxiety. "The key is identifying exactly what triggers her panic," Megan explained as she prepared. "Is it weight in the stirrup? Pressure on her back? The motion of a leg swinging over? Each possibility requires a different approach." With meticulous patience, Megan began testing different mounting components in isolation. First, she simply placed weight in the left stirrup while standing beside the mare, ready to release at the first sign of tension. Duchess remained calm. Next, she applied gentle pressure to different points along the mare's back. Again, no reaction. It was only when Megan simulated the motion of a leg swinging over, without actually mounting, that Duchess showed her first signs of anxiety. Elevated head, tense muscles, rapid breathing. "There's our trigger," Megan said quietly, immediately removing the pressure and allowing the mare to process. "It's not pain, it's the specific movement that signals someone is about to sit on her." She spent the next hour gradually desensitizing Duchess to this particular motion, never pushing beyond the mare's tolerance threshold, rewarding each moment of acceptance with release and quiet praise. By session's end, Duchess was allowing the simulated mounting motion with significantly less anxiety, not complete acceptance, but measurable progress. "That was remarkable," Eleanor said as they returned the mare to her stall afterward. "You identified in one session what multiple veterinarians and trainers missed entirely. They were looking for physical causes because that's easier to address," Megan replied, taking time to ensure Duchess was comfortable before leaving her stall. "Psychological triggers require more patience to identify and resolve." As they walked from the stables toward the main complex, Eleanor grew unusually quiet, seeming to wrestle with some internal debate. Finally, she spoke with careful deliberation. "Megan, how much do you know about Westridge Enterprises' overall operations?" The question raised immediate caution flags. "Only what I've observed here and what's publicly known. They're diversified. Across technology, agriculture, and real estate development, primarily." Eleanor nodded, choosing her next words with care. "My brother's vision for this valley is complex. There are aspects that could significantly benefit traditional agriculture, and others that would fundamentally transform it." She paused. "Not everyone involved shares the same priorities or ethical boundaries." Before Megan could probe further, David Lawrence approached from the direction of the main house, his expression suggesting their conversation had not gone unnoticed. "Eleanor, the investment team has arrived for the watershed presentation," he said smoothly. "Jack is asking for you." Eleanor's expression revealed nothing, but she squeezed Megan's arm lightly before departing, a gesture that seemed to carry unspoken meaning. Lawrence remained, his attention shifting to Megan. "Making progress with our expensive lawn ornaments?" The dismissive characterization of the horses rankled, but Megan kept her response professional. "Steady progress with all three. Mr. Westridge has approved my methodology and timeline." Something like annoyance flickered across Lawrence's face, quickly masked. Yes, Jack has always had a soft spot for unconventional approaches. Nevertheless, the board expects results that justify the expenditure. "They'll have them," Megan replied with quiet confidence. "Rehabilitation can't be rushed, but it can be measured." Lawrence studied her with that calculating gaze she was coming to recognize as characteristic of Westridge executives. "You've made quite an impression in a short time." Jack rarely takes such personal interest in operational details. The comment seemed designed to elicit a response, so Megan offered none, maintaining a neutral expression. "You should join us for the watershed presentation," Lawrence continued, changing tactics. "It might help you understand the larger context of our work here." The invitation surprised her, given Lawrence's previous attempts to limit her exposure to anything beyond the equestrian program. "What's the presentation about?" "The future of Elk Valley," Lawrence replied with a thin smile. "Specifically, our comprehensive water management strategy. Since you've been having such interesting conversations with Matt Davidson, you might appreciate seeing the facts rather than local folklore." The reference to her fence line conversation with the neighboring rancher confirmed Megan's suspicion that her movements were being monitored more closely than she had realized. "I should check on Prometheus again before evening feeding," she demurred. "But thank you for the invitation." Lawrence's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Another time, perhaps. We'll be making similar presentations to the broader community soon." Enough. As he walked away, Megan felt the familiar sense that she was seeing only pieces of a much larger puzzle. Eleanor's cryptic warning, Lawrence's surveillance and sudden inclusion, Westridge's unexpected personal interest in her methods, all suggested currents flowing beneath the surface that she couldn't yet fully discern. Rather than returning to the stables as she had claimed, Megan took a different path that led toward the research facilities she had noticed during her initial exploration of the property. She had no specific plan beyond curiosity, but Eleanor's unfinished warning had intensified her desire to understand what was really happening at Westridge Ranch. The research complex was a series of modern buildings set apart from the traditional ranch operations, surrounded by security fencing and access control points. As Megan approached, she noted surveillance cameras and uniformed security personnel, measures that seemed excessive for standard agricultural research. She had no realistic way to access the buildings themselves, but she could observe the activity around them. Trucks arrived and departed throughout the day, some bearing scientific equipment, others with what appeared to be soil samples or water testing gear. Personnel in lab coats moved between buildings, many wearing identification badges that differed from those of regular ranch staff. As she watched from a distance that she hoped appeared casual, a familiar truck approached the main gate, Matt Davidson's pickup. This was unexpected. Why would the neighboring rancher who had warned her about Westridge's operations be visiting their most secure facility? Davidson parked and entered one of the buildings without being stopped or questioned, suggesting he was an expected visitor. Megan retreated to a maintenance shed that offered a view of the parking area, determined to satisfy her growing curiosity. She waited nearly an hour before Davidson emerged, accompanied by a woman in a lab coat whom Megan recognized as the sustainability consultant from the dinner at the main house. They appeared to be in serious discussion, with Davidson gesturing emphatically while the woman showed him something on a tablet. Finally, they shook hands, not the formal handshake of business acquaintances, but the familiar grip of people who knew each other well. Davidson returned to his truck and departed, his expression troubled but determined. Megan made her way back to the main stable complex, her mind working through this new puzzle piece. Davidson had portrayed himself as an opponent of Westridge's plans for the valley, yet here he was, meeting privately at the most restricted area of the operation. Either his opposition was not what it seemed, or there were dimensions to the situation she didn't yet understand. That evening, after completing her final checks on the horses, Megan drove into the small town of Elk Ridge. She needed distance from the ranch to process what she was learning, and the local diner seemed like a good place to observe without being observed. The Silver Spur Diner was a time capsule of rural Americana, vinyl booths, laminated menus, and walls decorated with local rodeo memorabilia and faded photographs of record cattle drives from better years. The dinner crowd was sparse, primarily locals whose conversations paused briefly when Megan entered, marking her as an outsider despite her familiar ranching attire. She chose a corner booth with a view of both the door and the parking lot, ordering coffee and the daily special from a waitress whose name tag identified her as Betty. "You're the new horse trainer out at Westridge," Betty commented as she poured the coffee. It wasn't a question. "Word travels fast," Megan replied with a small smile. "Small town," Betty shrugged. "Plus my nephew works maintenance at the ranch. Says you're doing some kind of horse therapy with those fancy thoroughbreds." Megan nodded, unsurprised that her work was common knowledge. "Rehabilitation, yes. Helping horses with behavioral issues." Betty seemed to weigh her next words carefully. "Folks around here have mixed feelings about Westridge. Brings jobs and money, but changes things too. The old ways are disappearing." "I've heard some concerns," Megan acknowledged, keeping her tone neutral, "especially about water rights." Betty glanced around before leaning closer. "Water's just part of it. There's something bigger happening. My nephew says they're bringing in scientists, engineers, government types. Whatever Westridge is planning, it's more than just fancy horses and cattle." The bell above the door jingled, interrupting their conversation. Matt Davidson entered, pausing when he saw Megan. After a moment's hesitation, he approached her booth. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Megan gestured to the seat across from her, curious about his appearance so soon after she had seen him at the research facility. "Settling in at Westridge?" he asked after ordering coffee from Betty, who retreated with a knowing look. "Getting there," Megan replied, studying him with new interest. "The work with the horses is fulfilling." Davidson nodded, seeming distracted. "Those thoroughbreds are worth more than my entire herd. Different world from working ranch horses. Different purpose, different training," Megan agreed. "But horses are horses at their core. They all need the same basic understanding." "Ah." Moment of silence stretched between them, heavy with unasked questions. Finally, Megan decided on directness. "I saw you at the research facility today," she said quietly. Seemed like an interesting meeting for someone who warned me about Westridge's operations. Davidson's expression tightened, but he didn't seem surprised by her observation. "It's complicated," he replied, his voice equally low. "Not everything at Westridge is what it appears to be, including the conflicts." Before he could elaborate, the diner door opened again, and Eleanor Westridge entered. Her appearance in the small-town establishment drew more attention than Megan's had, with several patrons openly staring at the wealthy equestrian. Eleanor spotted them immediately, approaching with purpose. "I thought I might find you here," she said to Megan, then nodded to Davidson. "Matt, good to see you." The familiar greeting confirmed Megan's suspicion that the relationship between Westridge Ranch and the Davidson family was more complex than simple corporate neighbor versus traditional rancher. "Join us?" Davidson offered, moving over to make room. Eleanor slid into the booth beside him, creating a triangle of conspiracy that made Megan increasingly certain she was about to learn something significant. "I need to finish our conversation from earlier," Eleanor said to Megan without preamble. "But not here." "Matt's ranch would be better." Davidson nodded in agreement. "More private. And there are things you should see." Megan's journalistic instincts battled with caution. These people were still essentially strangers, despite 3 weeks of professional interaction. "What's this about?" she asked directly. Eleanor and Davidson exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. "The future of Elk Valley," Eleanor replied, echoing Lawrence's earlier words but with a completely different inflection. "And why my brother really hired you." The drive to the Davidson ranch took about 20 minutes, following winding back roads that connected the valley's traditional properties. Megan followed Eleanor's SUV in her own truck, questions multiplying with each mile. The Davidson homestead was everything Westridge Ranch was not: modest, functional, built over generations rather than all at once, with unlimited resources. The main house was a well-maintained structure from the 1930s, with additions that chronicled the family's growth over decades. Equipment sheds housed machinery that was serviceable rather than state-of-the-art, and the corrals contained sturdy working quarter horses rather than million-dollar thoroughbreds. Yet there was pride in the property's upkeep, and the lights glowing from the house windows spoke of a genuine home rather than a corporate showcase. As they parked, an older man emerged onto the porch, Matt's father, judging by the family resemblance. "Got company, I see," he called out, his tone suggesting this was not an unusual occurrence. "Evening, Dad," Matt replied. "This is Megan Riley, the new trainer from Westridge. She needs to know what's really happening." The older Davidson studied Megan with weathered eyes that had seen decades of ranching challenges. "About time," he said cryptically, holding the door open for them to enter. Inside, the house was comfortably worn but meticulously clean. Walls decorated with family photographs chronicling generations of ranching life. They gathered around a large kitchen table where maps and documents were already spread out, suggesting this meeting had been planned well before Megan's chance encounter with Matt at the diner. "First things first," Eleanor began once they were seated. "What I'm about to share contradicts the public position of Westridge Enterprises. If Lawrence or the board discovered I was having this conversation, there would be significant consequences." Megan nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. "Why risk it, and why involve me?" "Because you're uniquely positioned to help," Matt replied. "You have legitimate access to the ranch, professional credibility, and no obvious connection to local interests that would raise suspicion." "Help with what exactly?" Megan pressed. Eleanor took a deep breath. "My brother's vision for Elk Valley is actually revolutionary, sustainable agriculture on a scale never before attempted, integrating traditional practices with cutting-edge technology to create a closed-loop system that could transform food production while preserving the environmental integrity of the region." This aligned with what Westridge himself had suggested, but Megan sensed there was more. The problem, the elder Davidson interjected, is that somewhere along the way, the money men got involved. Started changing things, cutting corners, prioritizing. Return on investment over the original vision. David Lawrence, Megan guessed, remembering the COO's dismissive attitude toward traditional ranching values. Eleanor nodded grimly. Lawrence and the board see the valley as a real estate play disguised as agricultural innovation. Their version of the plan involves depleting the aquifer, proving traditional ranching unsustainable, then pivoting to luxury development once they control the entire watershed. Matt spread out a hydrology map of the valley. These are the test wells Westridge has been drilling, supposedly for agricultural research. But they're actually assessing the feasibility of redirecting the entire watershed toward controlled areas, while draining others dry. My brother doesn't know, Eleanor added quickly. Or at least, doesn't know the full extent. Lawrence has been compartmentalizing information, presenting Jack with the research that supports the sustainable vision while implementing a very different plan on the ground. Megan studied the maps, noting how the test wells corresponded precisely to the boundaries between Westridge property and remaining family ranches. And Davidson Ranch is next on the acquisition list, she guessed. Last holdout, the elder Davidson confirmed. We control the headwaters that feed the North Valley. Without our property, their water management scheme doesn't work. What does this have to do with me? Megan asked, still not seeing her role in this complex situation. I'm just a horse trainer hired to rehabilitate 3 thoroughbreds. Eleanor and the Davidsons exchanged another of those meaningful glances that suggested there was still more to the story. The horses are real, and your job rehabilitating them is legitimate, Eleanor assured her. But there was another reason my brother specifically sought you out after the stable fire. She slid a folder across the table. Inside was a stack of newspaper clippings and magazine articles, all featuring Megan Riley from her days as a rising star in equine rehabilitation. Your methods directly parallel what Jack originally envisioned for the valley, Eleanor explained. Patience over force. Understanding natural patterns rather than imposing artificial ones. Building trust instead of demanding compliance. Matt leaned forward. We need someone close to Westridge who can help him see what's really happening. Someone who exemplifies the values his project was supposed to embody before Lawrence and the board started corrupting it. You want me to spy on my employer? Megan asked incredulously. Not spy, Eleanor corrected firmly. Educate. Remind my brother why he started this project in the first place. Help him see how his original vision is being subverted. The elder Davidson spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of generations. This valley has sustained families for over a century because we understood something corporations forget. You don't own the land, you belong to it. You're its caretaker for the next generation. Megan sat back, absorbing the magnitude of what they were asking. This is a lot to process. Why should I believe you over Westridge himself? For all I know, this could be a ploy to undermine his legitimate business interests. Fair question, Eleanor acknowledged. She reached into her bag and produced a thumb drive. These are the original planning documents for the Elk Valley Sustainable Agriculture Initiative, Jack's personal vision as he first conceived it. Compare them to what's actually happening on the ground and draw your own conclusions. Matt added quietly, We're not asking you to sabotage anything or betray confidences. Just pay attention, ask questions, and help Jack reconnect with the principles that started this whole project. As the conversation continued into the night, Megan learned the full history of Westridge's interest in Elk Valley, how it had begun as a genuine attempt to create a model of sustainable agriculture that honored traditional practices while incorporating technological innovation. How Lawrence and the investment board had gradually shifted the focus toward land acquisition and water rights consolidation, with an ultimate goal of luxury development rather than agricultural transformation. The evidence was compelling. Original documents versus current implementation. Hydrology reports showing targeted depletion of certain aquifers. Internal memos revealing a phased approach to forcing out family operations. By the time Megan drove back to Westridge Ranch in the early hours of the morning, her mind was racing with implications. The job she had accepted, rehabilitation of 3 troubled horses, remained genuine. But it now appeared to be embedded within a much larger and more morally complex situation than she had imagined. Tomorrow she would continue her patient work with Midnight Emperor, Prometheus, and Duchess, building trust and healing trauma through consistent, respectful interaction. But she would also begin paying closer attention to the larger patterns unfolding around her: the research facility activities, the water testing operations, the subtle shifts in Lawrence's strategy as he maneuvered toward control of the entire valley. What she couldn't yet decide was whether Jackson Westridge was villain or victim in this unfolding drama, a corporate predator disguising his true intentions behind noble rhetoric, or a visionary whose project was being corrupted by those he had trusted to implement it. The truth, she suspected, lay somewhere in the complex territory between these extremes. And somehow, improbably, her special connection with troubled horses had placed her at the center of a conflict that would determine not just her own future, but the future of an entire community and way of life. 2 months into her position at Westridge Ranch, Megan found herself standing in the center of the round pen, Duchess circling her at a relaxed trot. In her hand, she held a mounting block, the very object that had once triggered the marais. Panic, now just another element in their daily routine. The transformation was remarkable to those who had known the horse's history. "Hand me the saddle," Megan called softly to Eleanor, who stood outside the round pen with the English leather saddle that had once signaled terror to the marais. Eleanor passed it over the fence, her expression a mixture of amazement and approval. "I never thought I'd see this day," she admitted. 3 different trainers gave up on her. "They gave up on themselves, not on her," Megan replied, approaching Duchess with calm confidence. The marais stood quietly as Megan placed the saddle on her back, adjusted it, and slowly tightened the girth. No trembling, no wide eyes, no tension. In her muscles, just peaceful acceptance. This was the culmination of 8 weeks of methodical trust-building. Megan had identified the exact triggers of Duchess's fear, not pain as everyone had assumed, but a traumatic memory associated with a specific sequence of mounting movements. By breaking that sequence into tiny, manageable pieces and rebuilding the marais' confidence with each component, she had gradually transformed panic into understanding. "Are you ready to try mounting today?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice low to avoid disturbing the calm atmosphere Megan had created. Megan shook her head slightly. "One more week of preparation. Today is about simulating weight in the stirrups while I'm beside her. Rushing the final step would undo everything we've accomplished." Eleanor nodded her understanding. This patient, incremental approach was exactly what had impressed her about Megan's methods from the beginning, and what had drawn her brother's attention as well. As if summoned by the thought, Jackson Westridge appeared at the fence line. Today accompanied not by Lawrence, but by a small group of people in business attire whom Megan didn't recognize. "Board members," Eleanor whispered, noticing Megan's questioning glance. "Here for the quarterly review. Jack must be showing them your progress firsthand." Megan continued her work with Duchess, outwardly focused on the marais while acutely aware of the observers. She placed her foot in the stirrup, gradually applying weight while maintaining physical contact with the marais' neck and shoulder, a technique that allowed Duchess to feel Megan's calm energy throughout the process. The marais stood rock steady, a far cry from the panicked rearing that had once made her dangerous to handle. Megan removed her foot, praised the marais quietly, and repeated the process on the other side, a variation that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. When the session was complete, Megan removed the saddle and released Duchess to move freely in the round pen, the mare choosing to stay near Megan rather than retreat, perhaps the most telling sign of their transformed relationship. Only then did she acknowledge the observers, approaching the fence where Westridge and the board members waited. "Impressive work, Ms. Rayleigh," one of the women said, her tailored suit and sharp assessment marking her as a senior executive, especially considering this animal's history. "Thank you," Megan replied simply. "Duchess is doing the hard work. I'm just creating the conditions that allow her to succeed." Your 6-week report showed quantifiable progress with all 3 subjects, another board member commented, consulting a tablet. "Particularly noteworthy with the stallion, given his aggressive tendencies." Megan had prepared extensive documentation for that presentation, translating her intuitive understanding of equine psychology into the data-driven metrics that corporate decision-makers could appreciate. Heart rates, approach distances, stress, behaviors, all tracked methodically to demonstrate the steady improvement that might otherwise be invisible to untrained observers. "Midnight Emperor has moved from active aggression to cautious acceptance," she confirmed. "We're now able to conduct limited handling sessions without restraints, which was unthinkable when I arrived." "And the investment jumper?" asked the first woman. "Prometheus, correct? Any progress toward returning him to competition value?" The question revealed the board's primary concern, financial return rather than animal welfare. Megan chose her response carefully. "Prometheus is now accepting groundwork near jump equipment without anxiety triggers. We've begun incorporating elements of his previous jumping routine in controlled settings. His physical condition remains excellent, and his natural talent is undiminished. With continued progress at the current rate, I believe he could return to lower-level competition within 3 months, with a gradual build back to his previous caliber." This assessment seemed to satisfy the board members, who exchanged approving glances. Westridge himself had remained silent during this exchange, observing Megan with that calculated gaze that revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Ms. Riley's rehabilitation program represents exactly the approach I outlined when we acquired these animals," he finally said. "Patience, understanding, and respect for natural processes yield results that force and expediency cannot match." Something in his tone suggested he was making a point beyond horse training, perhaps directed at the board members themselves. Megan recalled Eleanor's revelation about the conflict between Westridge's original vision for the valley and the board's more aggressive implementation. "The quarterly financials reflect the wisdom of this approach," Westridge continued. 3 assets, previously written down to minimal value, are now on track for full recovery, with Prometheus potentially exceeding his acquisition price at his next competition. This was clearly the language the board members understood, their expressions shifting from polite interest to genuine approval. "Well done, Ms. Riley," the lead board member concluded. "Continue your work with our full support." As the group moved on to their next inspection point, Eleanor lingered behind with Megan. "That was a victory," she said quietly. "Not just for the horses, but potentially for the valley. Jack used your success to reinforce his original philosophy with the board. Patience over force, understanding over exploitation," Megan considered this as she led Duchess back to her stall. "Has he reviewed the original planning documents you mentioned? The ones that Lawrence has supposedly been modifying?" Eleanor's expression clouded. "Not yet. Lawrence keeps him too busy with daily operations to step back and see the big picture. But this board visit might create an opening. They've seen your approach working firsthand. It creates a foundation to question other aspects of implementation." Over the past month, Megan had been quietly gathering her own evidence about the true nature of Westridge Enterprises' activities in Elk Valley. Her position gave her legitimate access to much of the property, and her work with the horses provided a natural explanation for her presence in various locations. What she had discovered largely confirmed Eleanor and the Davidsons' claims. The research facility was indeed focusing primarily on water management rather than sustainable agriculture, specifically technologies for redirecting aquifer access and creating artificial scarcity in targeted areas. More troubling were the documents she had found in the shared computer system when researching her horse's medical histories. While looking for vaccination records, she had accidentally accessed a folder containing phase development plans for Elk Valley estates, luxury homes, a golf course, and resort facilities to be built on land currently occupied by family ranches, including the Davidson property. The timestamp on these plans predated her arrival at Westridge Ranch, suggesting they weren't a recent deviation but had been in development for some time. The question remained whether Jackson Westridge himself had authorized this direction or was being kept in the dark by Lawrence and the board. That evening, Megan received an unexpected summons to Westridge's private office in the main house. She arrived to find him alone, studying the progress reports she had submitted on each horse. "Your documentation is exemplary," he said without preamble as she entered. "Far more comprehensive than I expected, even knowing your reputation." "Thank you," Megan replied, unsure where this conversation was heading. Westridge set aside the reports and regarded her with that inscrutable gaze. "Tell me, Ms. Riley, what do you think of our operation here? Not just the equestrian program, but Westridge Ranch as a whole." The directness of the question took her by surprise. This seemed like an opening to address the concerns Eleanor had raised, yet caution was still warranted. "It's impressive in scale and resources," she began carefully. "Though I've noticed some inconsistencies between different aspects of the operation." Westridge raised an eyebrow. "Inconsistencies?" "Between stated goals and actual implementation," Megan clarified, deciding to test the waters. "For instance, the research facility appears focused primarily on water management technologies rather than sustainable agricultural practices." A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or confirmation, crossed Westridge's face before his composed expression returned. "You're observant," he acknowledged. "Water management is a critical component of any sustainable agricultural system, particularly in regions like this one." "True," Megan agreed. "But redirecting water resources away from existing agricultural operations seems contradictory to sustainability goals." The statement hung in the air between them, a clear indication that Megan knew more than her position as horse trainer might suggest. Westridge studied her for a long moment before coming to some internal decision. He rose and moved to a wall safe hidden behind a landscape painting, entering a combination and removing a thick binder. "Are you familiar with the concept of watershed restoration in degraded landscapes, Ms. Riley?" he asked, returning to his desk. "Only generally," Megan admitted. "Re-establishing natural water flow patterns disrupted by development or poor land management." Westridge nodded, opening the binder to reveal detailed hydrology maps of Elk Valley, similar to those she had seen at the Davidson Ranch, but more comprehensive. This valley was once one of the most productive natural grassland ecosystems in the region, he explained. Over a century of conventional ranching has disrupted the natural watershed, leading to increased runoff, soil erosion, and aquifer depletion. He turned several pages, revealing historical photographs that showed dramatic changes in the landscape over decades. "My original vision for Westridge Ranch was to demonstrate how these patterns could be reversed, not by abandoning agriculture, but by reimagining it according to the natural hydrology of the region." This aligned with what Eleanor had told her about Westridge's initial concept, but didn't explain the luxury development plans Megan had discovered. "And how does Elk Valley Estates fit into that vision?" she asked directly. "The resort and golf course development I saw in the planning documents." Westridge's expression hardened, confirming that this information was not something he had intended her to know. Where did you encounter those documents, Ms. Riley? In the shared database while researching veterinary records, she replied honestly. It was an accidental access, but the plans were quite detailed and contradictory to the sustainable agriculture model you just described. A long silence followed as Westridge seemed to reassess both Megan and the situation. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed, less the corporate executive and more the visionary who had originally conceived the project. Those plans were not part of my original concept, he admitted. They represent what Lawrence and certain board members believe is a more profitable use of the acquired land. A phase 2 that would follow the consolidation of water rights. Does that align with your personal vision for the valley? Megan pressed gently. Another long pause followed as Westridge seemed to weigh how much to reveal. No, he said finally. It doesn't. But corporate governance is complex, Ms. Riley. The board has fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders. Lawrence makes compelling financial arguments. The same arguments could be made about your approach to the horses, Megan pointed out. Quick fixes through force or medication would show faster results on quarterly statements. But you supported my longer-term, more sustainable approach because you recognized its superior outcomes. Westridge smiled slightly, the first genuine smile Megan had seen from him, an apt analogy. And one that occurred to me during your presentation to the board today. He closed the binder and regarded her with new interest. You've had conversations. With Eleanor, I assume, and likely the Davidsons as well. Megan saw no point in denial. Yes, they shared concerns about the direction of the project under Lawrence's influence. And now you're trying to rehabilitate me along with the horses, Westridge observed, though there was no anger in his tone. Reminding me of my original vision before Lawrence and the board began reshaping it. The situations are not entirely dissimilar, Megan acknowledged. Both involve returning to first principles after trauma or outside influence has created dysfunction. Westridge laughed, a short, surprised sound. Blunt, but accurate. Lawrence would have you terminated for such a comparison. Probably, Megan agreed. But you hired me for my approach to rehabilitation, not my diplomacy skills. Indeed. I did. Westridge rose and moved to the windows overlooking the valley, now bathed in the golden light of sunset. I started this project with genuine intentions. Ms. Riley, a model of how agriculture could work in harmony with natural systems rather than in opposition to them. What changed? Megan asked quietly. The usual culprits. Financial pressures. Shareholder expectations. Quarterly reporting cycles. He sighed. Lawrence is excellent at what he does, translating vision into profitability. But somewhere along the way, the vision became secondary to the profit. He turned back to face her. Your work with the horses has been illuminating. A reminder that patience and respect for natural processes yield better results than force and artificial timelines. This opening seemed too perfect to ignore. Perhaps the same principles could be reapplied to the Valley Project? A return to the original vision? Perhaps, Westridge agreed, though his expression suggested he recognized the challenges. Though, unwinding the current implementation would be complex. Lawrence has structured operations specifically to advance his version of the plan. Complex isn't impossible, Megan replied. Duchess would have been euthanized under conventional wisdom. Midnight Emperor would have been relegated to isolated breeding via artificial insemination. Prometheus would have been sold at a loss. All because the conventional approach lacked the patience to understand and address the real issues. Westridge studied her with new appreciation. You're more than a horse trainer, Ms. Riley. Just someone who believes in looking beyond symptoms to understand root causes, she replied simply. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. David Lawrence entered without waiting. For a response, his expression shifting from businesslike to suspicious when he saw Megan. Jack, the board is waiting for the final presentation, he said. pointedly ignoring Megan. The watershed management projections are ready. Thank you, David. I'll be there shortly. Westridge's tone made it clear this was a dismissal. Lawrence hesitated, clearly uncomfortable leaving Westridge and Megan alone, but finally departed with obvious reluctance. It seems our conversation must continue another time, Westridge said once Lawrence had gone. But you've given me much to consider, Ms. Riley. The horses will be ready for your inspection tomorrow afternoon, Megan replied, returning to her official role. Midnight Emperor has made exceptional progress this week. As she left Westridge's office, Megan felt a cautious optimism. For the first time, she had glimpsed the visionary beneath the corporate exterior, the man whose original concept for Elk Valley had aligned with principles of sustainability and respect for natural systems before Lawrence and the board had redirected it toward conventional profit maximization. Whether that glimpse would translate into meaningful change remained to be seen. Lawrence clearly wielded significant influence, and corporate inertia was a powerful force. But Megan had planted seeds of reconnection to first principles, using Westridge's own investment in the horses as a bridge to his larger vision. The following morning brought an unexpected development. As Megan arrived at the stables for her daily sessions, she found Eleanor waiting with an expression of barely contained excitement. Jack spent the night reviewing the original planning documents, she reported in a hushed tone. All of them, the watershed restoration plans, the sustainable grazing rotation, the community integration strategy. Everything Lawrence has been systematically modifying. How do you know? Megan asked, surprised by this sudden development. He called me at midnight, asking questions about specific details Lawrence had told him were impractical. He hadn't realized how dramatically the implementation had diverged from his original concept. This was a significant breakthrough, though Megan maintained cautious optimism. What happens now? Emergency board meeting this morning, Eleanor replied. Jack's called in the original environmental consultants who helped develop the initial plan. Lawrence is furious. I overheard him on the phone trying to discredit the whole thing as naive idealism. Before they could discuss further, a ranch hand approached with an urgent message. Megan's presence was requested at the main house immediately. Not in Westridge's private office this time, but in the main conference room where the board meeting was apparently taking place. Why would they want me there? Megan wondered aloud. Eleanor's expression was equally confused. I have no idea. This is completely outside normal protocol. With a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, Megan made her way to the main house. The conference room she was led to contained the full Westridge Enterprises board, the same individuals who had observed her work with Duchess the previous day, along with Jackson Westridge at the head of the table and David Lawrence, whose expression could only be described as barely contained fury. Ms. Riley, thank you for joining us. Westridge greeted her with unexpected formality. The board has some questions about your observations of our operation. Lawrence interjected immediately. This is highly irregular, Jack. Ms. Riley is a horse trainer, not a corporate analyst. Her presence at this meeting is inappropriate and potentially compromises sensitive information. On the contrary, Westridge replied coolly, Ms. Riley has demonstrated exceptional observational skills and analytical thinking in her work here. Her perspective as someone relatively new to our operation, but deeply familiar with principles of natural systems, may be valuable to this discussion. The lead board member, the same woman who had questioned Megan about Prometheus, leaned forward with interest. You've been at Westridge Ranch for approximately 2 months. Ms. Riley, during that time, have you observed any operational practices that seem inconsistent with sustainable agricultural principles? The directness of the question suggested. This meeting had a very specific purpose, one that Lawrence was clearly unhappy about. Megan chose her words carefully, aware that her response could influence decisions affecting the entire valley. I've observed what appear to be two parallel operations, she began. The stated Sustainable Agriculture Initiative, which includes the equestrian program I'm part of, and a separate water management program that seems designed to consolidate control of the watershed in ways that would ultimately make traditional agriculture impossible for neighboring properties. Lawrence's face flushed with anger. This is absurd. She has no expertise in water management or agricultural planning. Her observations are meaningless in this context. Let her finish, David, Westridge said firmly. Megan continued, her confidence growing. The research facility is primarily focused on technologies for redirecting aquifer access away from neighboring properties. I've seen the test well data and the resulting impact on surrounding land. Additionally, I accidentally accessed planning documents for Elk Valley Estates, a luxury development that would replace existing agricultural operations once water rights have been fully consolidated. Several board members exchanged troubled glances at this revelation. The lead member turned to Lawrence. Is this accurate, David? Has the implementation diverged from the sustainable agriculture model the board originally approved? Lawrence's response was defensive. We've adapted the implementation to market realities. The original plan was idealistic, but financially questionable. Our current approach maximizes shareholder value while maintaining the appearance of the sustainability initiative. The appearance, Westridge repeated, his tone dangerously quiet. Not the substance. Jack, be reasonable, Lawrence appealed. The luxury development represents a potential return on investment 10 times greater than the sustainable agriculture model. It's simply good business. It's not the business I proposed, nor what the board approved, Westridge countered. And it appears you've been deliberately compartmentalizing information to prevent me from seeing the full picture of implementation. The confrontation Megan was witnessing suggested a significant power struggle was unfolding, one that would determine not just the future of Westridge Ranch but the entire valley. Ms. Riley, the lead board member addressed her again. Based on your professional experience with rehabilitation, do you believe the original sustainable agriculture model Mr. Westridge conceived as viable? Or do you agree with Mr. Lawrence that it represents impractical idealism? The question placed enormous responsibility on Megan's shoulders. Her answer could influence decisions affecting countless lives and thousands of acres of land. She took a deep breath, centering herself as she did before working with her troubled horses. In my work, I've learned that the most effective approaches honor natural systems rather than imposing artificial ones, she began. Quick fixes through force or chemicals might show faster results on paper, but they create long-term dysfunction that ultimately costs more to address. She gestured toward the windows overlooking the valley. This land has supported agriculture for generations because traditional ranchers understood its natural patterns. They weren't perfect stewards. Overgrazing and poor water management have created problems, but wholesale replacement with luxury development would destroy the ecosystem entirely. Megan turned directly to Westridge. Your original vision recognized that the most sustainable path forward lies in combining traditional knowledge with innovative technology, not in erasing the existing community and landscape. That's not idealism, it's enlightened pragmatism. A long silence followed her statement. Lawrence stared at her with naked hostility, while several board members appeared thoughtful. Westridge himself wore an expression Megan couldn't quite interpret, something between vindication and renewed purpose. Finally, the lead board member spoke. I believe we have sufficient information to make a determination. Mr. Westridge, in light of these revelations about implementation divergence, what course of action do you recommend? Westridge stood, assuming a natural authority that seemed to fill the room. I propose an immediate return to the original sustainable agriculture model with modifications based on what we've learned during implementation. This would include halting all activities related to the Elk Valley Estates development and redirecting those resources toward watershed restoration and community integration. Lawrence began to protest, but Westridge continued over his objections. Additionally, I recommend a complete restructuring of project leadership, with direct oversight from board representatives committed to the original vision rather than its subversion. The message was clear. Lawrence's role would be dramatically reduced, if not eliminated entirely. What followed was a tense procedural discussion as the board considered Westridge's proposal. Legal implications, financial projections, and implementation logistics were debated in the clinical language of corporate governance. Throughout, Megan remained silent, having said her piece and now witnessing the corporate machinery process. The implications. After nearly an hour of discussion, the board voted 7-2 in favor of Westridge's proposal, with the stipulation that detailed implementation plans be presented within 30 days. Lawrence sat stone-faced through the vote, his defeat evident, but his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. As the meeting concluded, board members filed out, several nodding respectfully to Megan as they passed. Lawrence departed without acknowledgement, his back rigid with suppressed anger. Only Westridge remained, studying Megan with that calculating gaze that now seemed less corporate and more genuinely curious. "That was quite a performance, Ms. Riley," he said when they were alone. "You spoke with remarkable conviction for someone who's only been here 2 months. The principles are the same whether I'm rehabilitating horses or evaluating land management," Megan replied. "Understand the natural system, identify what's disrupting it, and patiently restore balance rather than imposing artificial solutions." Westridge nodded thoughtfully. "A philosophy I once embraced wholeheartedly before Lawrence convinced me that market realities required compromise." "The market is just another system," Megan observed. "One that can be aligned with natural principles rather than opposed to them, given the right approach." "Indeed." Westridge moved to the windows, gazing out at the valley his company now controlled. "Which brings me to a proposition, Ms. Riley. Your work with the horses has been exceptional, but I believe your talents could be applied to a larger canvas." Megan waited, uncertain where this was heading. "With Lawrence's departure, we'll need someone to help reconnect our implementation with the original vision, someone who understands both natural systems and the importance of community integration, someone with both practical experience and philosophical alignment." The implication was clear and utterly unexpected. "You're offering me a position beyond horse rehabilitation?" "Director of Sustainability and Community Integration," Westridge confirmed, "working directly with Eleanor and the environmental consultants to ensure the project returns to its original principles. Your experience with the horses would remain valuable. They're living examples of the patient, respectful approach we need to apply throughout the operation." The offer was breathtaking in its scope, a leap from horse trainer to executive leadership in a major corporation. Yet something in it resonated deeply with Megan's own values and vision. "I'd need assurances about the Davidson Ranch," she said, testing Westridge's commitment to genuine change. "Their property is essential to any truly sustainable approach to the watershed." "Agreed," Westridge replied without hesitation. "Instead of acquisition, we'd propose a partnership, maintaining their ownership and operational independence while integrating their traditional knowledge into the broader initiative. Similar arrangements would be offered to other family ranches willing to participate." This was exactly the approach Eleanor had described from the original vision: partnership rather than acquisition, integration rather than replacement. "I'd need time to consider," Megan said, though she already felt drawn to the possibility of influencing the entire valley's future. "Of course," Westridge agreed. "The position would be available when you're ready. In the meantime, continue your work with the horses. Their rehabilitation remains a priority and a model for our approach to the larger project." As Megan left the conference room, her mind was spinning with possibilities. From homeless drifter to corporate director in just over 2 months, a transformation as dramatic as any she had facilitated with her equine charges. Eleanor was waiting anxiously in the main entrance hall. What happened? The board members left looking thoughtful, and Lawrence stormed out like a thundercloud. Megan quickly related the meeting's events and Westridge's unexpected job offer. Eleanor's expression shifted from surprise to delight. I knew Jack would find his way back to the original vision if given the right perspective, she said. Your approach with the horses provided exactly the example he needed, tangible proof that patience and respect yield better results than force and expediency. It's still just a beginning, Megan cautioned. Changing course for an entire corporate initiative won't happen overnight. No, Eleanor agreed, but it's a genuine start. And having you involved in leadership would ensure the principles remain central to implementation. As they walked together toward the stables where 3 healing horses awaited their daily sessions, Megan reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. From sleeping under the stars on abandoned ranch land to potentially helping shape the future of an entire agricultural community, all because she had responded to smoke on the horizon without hesitation, using skills honed through years of dedicated practice. There's someone else who should hear this news, Eleanor said, guiding their path toward the eastern property boundary. Sure enough, Matt Davidson was riding fence on the neighboring property, his expression lifting in recognition as they approached. The conversation that followed was filled with cautious hope as Megan outlined the board's decision and Westridge's proposed new direction. Matt's initial skepticism gradually gave way to guarded optimism as the details emerged, particularly the shift from acquisition to partnership. Dad always said Westridge wasn't the real problem. It was the money men around him pushing their own agenda. Matt reflected. Maybe the old man was right. Speaking of partnerships, Eleanor interjected with a meaningful glance between Matt and Megan. I suspect the two of you might find plenty of common ground in the new implementation approach. Megan felt a flash of warmth at the suggestion, one that intensified when she met Matt's gaze and saw similar awareness there. Their shared commitment to the valley's future had created a connection that might grow into something more personal, given time and opportunity. As they parted ways, Matt called after her, "So does this mean you're staying in Elk Valley for the long term?" Megan considered the question. The homeless drifter asked to put down roots in the community she had once merely passed through. "I think it does," she replied, surprised by how right the answer felt. "These horses still need me. And it seems the valley might too." "Good," Matt said simply, though his smile suggested deeper meaning. "Very good." Later that afternoon, as Megan worked with Prometheus in the round pen, gradually introducing jumping equipment in a controlled, positive context, she reflected on the parallel journeys of rehabilitation unfolding around her. The troubled horses finding their way back to trust and confidence. The corporate vision returning to its original principles of sustainability and respect. Her own life transforming from rootless survival to purposeful contribution. All of these journeys shared common elements: patience over force, understanding over domination, healing over exploitation. The same principles that had guided her work with horses could indeed apply to land management, community building, and perhaps even her own heart as it cautiously opened to new possibilities. Jackson Westridge watched from a distance as Prometheus willingly approached a small ground pole that would have triggered panic weeks earlier. The transformation in the valuable jumper mirrored the transformation now beginning in Westridge's corporate approach, a return to first principles after a period of misdirection. "Remarkable progress," he commented as he joined Megan at the fence, "with both the horse and the larger project." "Both required reconnecting with original purpose," Megan replied. "Remembering what matters beyond immediate results." Westridge nodded thoughtfully. "A lesson I nearly forgot until a homeless cowgirl appeared on my property and started rehabilitating more than just horses." As the golden afternoon light bathed the valley, highlighting the contours of land that it supported. Generations of agricultural communities, Megan felt a profound sense of rightness. The path forward would not be simple. Corporate inertia, Lawrence's lingering influence, and the practical challenges of implementation would all present obstacles. But the foundation had been laid for something truly transformative, a model of agriculture that honored both innovation and tradition, that valued community as much as profit, that recognized the intelligence of natural systems rather than seeking to override them. And at the center of this unfolding story stood a woman who had lost everything, only to find a new purpose through the very skills that had once defined her. Megan Riley, once homeless and adrift, now poised to help guide the future of Elk Valley toward a vision that balanced progress with preservation, profit with principle, development with respect. The deed to the $50 million property would never literally be hers. But something more valuable was being offered instead, the opportunity to help steward the land and community toward a future that honored its past while embracing new possibilities. For someone who had once been defined by what she had lost, this new role as guardian and guide represented a form of ownership far more meaningful than any legal title. As Prometheus nudged her gently with his nose, a gesture of trust unimaginable. Just weeks earlier, Megan felt the full circle of her journey. From the desperate woman who had once slept under the stars on abandoned ranch land to a leader, helping shape a sustainable future for an entire community. All because she had stopped to help when help was needed, using the skills and values that defined her even when everything else had been taken away. Some journeys end exactly where they need to, even when the destination could never have been imagined at the beginning. For Megan Riley, that destination was right here, among healing horses, restorative land practices, and a community finding its way back to balance between tradition and progress, guided by principles as timeless as the land itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,